All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today you're getting my final score prediction for this weekend's matchup between the Atlanta Falcons, Carolina Panthers. Talk about how the Falcons can scheme ways to slow down Carolina's pass rush, as well as talk about Falcons defensive coordinator Dean Pease, and he discussing the reasons why he is reluctant to play certain young players.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at falcfans, writing weekly columns over at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by McDonald's, proudly serving communities since 1965. McDonald's has always been more than just a place to get tasty, affordable food. It's the unofficial community center. A big thank you to our friends at McDonald's for always being there. I'm loving it. So today's episode, we'll be discussing my final score prediction for this upcoming Week 8 matchup between the Falcons and Panthers, listening to or answering a listener question about how Deion Jones won NFC Defensive Player of the Week. We'll talk about Falcons defensive coordinator Dean Pease's comments to the media on Thursday, in which he discussed why the Falcons aren't as quick to throw some of their young guys to the wolves as maybe some people hope. And we'll talk about Caleb McGarry and the Falcons pass protection holding up against this Panthers pass rush by employing the same strategy that they did to keep Jason Spriggs protected against the Dolphins pass rush this past week. But before we get into all of that, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen of the day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And of course, now Locked On Falcons is, of course, free and available on YouTube, where you can subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Help us out there. Leave a comment, give us a like, all the various things that can help us boost our standing with the YouTube algorithm as we, now go head into week 3 of being on YouTube. So go check us out there if you haven't already. But jumping into the conversation at hand, if you listen to yesterday's crossover podcast that we did with Locked On Panthers, at the end, you know that I wasn't particularly optimistic about the Falcons' chances of winning Sunday's game against Carolina. And, it boils down to a nagging feeling I've had that I think the Falcons are due for a letdown. And I feel like the Panthers defense will be a formidable challenge for them. And so there's a decent chance that letdown will happen against Carolina this upcoming week, where we've seen this Falcons offense really humming, scoring on average 29 points a game over the last 3 weeks. But my guess is against a better Panthers defense, you'll probably see not as high an output, maybe something around 20, 24 points or something like that, maybe closer to that number, which puts this in the winnable realm for a team like Carolina. I think if the Falcons obviously can, obviously the goal is to outscore your opponent, but like if the Falcons can get to like 28 or more, I feel good about them winning this game. If it's lower than that, then I feel the lower that number is, the less I feel optimistic about the Falcons outscoring Carolina in order to win the game. Although the thing about Carolina's defense, although it has generally been good, these last 4 weeks when they've been struggling in their losing streak, they've been, at least when you look at the average DVOA, defensive DVOA ranking that they've had over the last 4 weeks, it is much closer to a bottom 10 team than it is to a top 10 team, where they're currently, I think, 11th in DVOA rankings on defense. So hopefully the Falcons can sort of expose that reality a little bit more this week and score in the upper 20s, if not potentially in the 30s. So while I do feel like this is going to be a little bit of a letdown game for at least the offensive standpoint, I'm, the more I sit here and think about it, the more I feel a little bit better than I did yesterday, picking the Falcons to win. So if I was going to give a final score prediction, it would probably be the Falcons win like 26-24. which would mean, if that wound up being the final score, the Panthers would cover the 3-point spread. So because I feel like this game is a little bit more of a toss up, generally speaking, when you have a close spread like that, you tend to bet on the underdog in this case when it feels like the game could go in either direction. But that would be my betting advice. But then again, you probably guys shouldn't listen to too much of my betting advice, given I haven't had that much success this upcoming season or this current season. So right now, I'm feeling a little bit better about this Panthers game. And so if I was predicting one of these next two games to be a letdown game, it would probably be the Saints game coming up next week as opposed to this week. So we'll see. We'll see on Sunday how if that prediction is winds up being accurate. So let's move on from that and talk about a listener question that got sent in from Todd McShay. I don't think this is the real Todd McShay because his Twitter handle is @ShellM. He asks, can you help me understand what Deion Jones did to earn NFC Defensive Player of the Week? He had 15 tackles and a sack. And generally, I think those, defensive or offensive or special teams player of the week awards tend to be, not to dismiss them, but they tend to be very box score heavy related, right? Usually it goes, particularly the defensive player of the week award goes to a guy that has multiple sacks or multiple interceptions or a sack and an interception in a game. And in Debo's case, he had a ton of tackles and a sack. I thought Deion Jones played generally well in this game. I thought it was certainly one of his better games he's played this year. He had some mistakes, but to me, when I look at the two standout games he's had this year, I would count the Dolphins game as one and the Giants game as the other. And I thought he did make a number of plays. Again, it wasn't perfect by any means, but I think he deserves praise for that. Now, whether he was the best defensive player in the NFC all week long, that I couldn't tell you that. His performance didn't immediately jump out to me in that form or fashion. But given that we don't spend that much time on Locked On Falcons praising Deion Jones all that much, we'll give him his flowers when he gets them, and we'll give him the praise that he somewhat deserves this particular week. So I'm not complaining about Deion Jones winning Defensive Player of the Week. So again, Deion deserves credit when credit is due, and as one of the few veterans, starting for the team, and holdover veterans, I should say, starting for the team, there were high expectations that some of these veteran guys like Deion Jones would be able to immediately benefit from, Dean Pease taking over the Falcons defense, but that hasn't necessarily been the case. Maybe Deion's performance against Miami shows that he's starting to pick up the defense, but what's interesting is Coach Pease was discussing some of these topics on Thursday in his press conference with the local media. And we'll discuss some of my takeaways from what he said in that press conference. But a lot of it seems to be focusing on having a lot more patience with several of the Falcons' young guys currently in development, as well as why there hasn't been as much pressure on the quarterbacks in recent weeks. And we'll get into that topic as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, guys, again, thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen of the day. But I have a recommendation for what should be your second listen of the day. And that is none other than the Locked On Hawks podcast hosted by Brad Rowland, where you can get the lowdown, the daily lowdown here on the NBA side of the Locked On Podcast Network on all things Atlanta Hawks. If you're not a Hawks fan, of course, the Locked On Podcast Network has you covered with a daily show devoted to your favorite NBA team. So go check out Locked On Hawks. Go check out Locked On Celtics, Locked On Bucks, whoever on your favorite podcast platform, whether it's Apple, Odyssey, Google, or Spotify. So today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by McDonald's, proudly serving communities since 1965 with tasty, affordable food. And when I'm heading to McDonald's, I'm usually locked in on getting fries and McNuggets, but McDonald's is a place where family and friends can come to reconnect. McDonald's is a place to recharge and refuel, whether you're coming home from a game or you're on that long road trip and you just need to rest your legs for a bit. It's a place where classmates can meet up for a study group, knowing that they'll have dependable Wi-Fi and endless supplies of fries and McFlurries. And with that dependable Wi-Fi, you can also watch or listen to your favorite Atlanta Falcons podcast, your favorite illustrious Atlanta Falcons podcast. So head over to your local McDonald's to refuel and connect. McDonald's, I'm loving it. So Dean Pease's press conferences that he has every week on Thursdays are always worth your while to check them out if you can. There's a good chance that probably moving forward, most Friday episodes here on Locked On Falcons, the illustrious Locked On Falcons, might be devoted, at least a chunk of the podcast will be devoted to something that Dean Pease said on the previous day's, press conference. And, this Thursday was no different. He basically talked a lot about why the team hasn't been able to generate as much pressure as of lately. And it's not easy to necessarily summarize what he was saying, but, beyond the obvious of, oh, well, they just don't have good enough players up front. That's certainly true. He didn't say that, but, I think we all recognize that as the thing that he won't say. But it's hard for the Falcons to simply just scheme up pressure, is what he talked about, in terms of just dialing up pressure by just blitzing a ton or whatever the case may be. And some of that, he said, was owed to the team being conservative at points due to specific game situations where it didn't make sense for the team to try to dial up pressure. And some of that was owed to that when they have been trying to dial up pressure, they haven't been effective at getting at the quarterback. And, that kind of makes it a waste of time if you're not going to be able to get to the quarterback. And then some of that was owed to the Falcon having moving parts in their secondary, which meant that, it would be tough for them to trust in those guys to hold their own on the back end in order to give the guys up front the time that they need to get that pressure. And he also mentioned how their man coverage has not been great this season. And that's an area that of improvement that he wants to make for this defense. And that makes it harder to dial up pressure, because generally speaking, it's much easier to dial up pressure if you can play man coverage on the back end than it is if you are playing zone coverage on the back end, because if you're throwing a zone blitz at somebody, there's going to be a hole in your defense. And if the quarterback sees it coming, that's going to be a problem. So I think all of those points made by Coach Pease were very good points. And, it makes me even more frustrated that I haven't fully charted the defense this year when I've been watching the tape and watching and charting their coverages and whatnot, and when they're getting pressure and all these various things, because this would be the point in the episode where I could just throw up a graphic on the screen for those of you watching on YouTube, and do basically a stats dump to either, point out exactly what Coach Pease is talking about in this regard. So it just doubly makes me motivated moving forward, particularly this weekend, to finally get that done and finish charting this defense, so that, in the future, when Dean Pease starts, spouting some of these things that he's talking about, I can sit here and say, okay, here's the data that backs up exactly what Coach Pease is talking about. So that's my bad for procrastinating on that end. The other thing that Coach Pease talked about was why some of the young players weren't being thrown to the wolves, or quote unquote, taking their lumps. And, he seemed to be focused on the young guys in the secondary, at least from what he was talking about. That seemed to be where I was reading between the lines of why certain young players have not been getting as much work so far this season. And, the taking your lump sentiment has been certainly one that I have expressed here on this podcast over the last few weeks, particularly at the safety position, where we've had some up and down performances from the starters like Eric Harris and Deron Harmon. And, it's led me to believe, and I'm sure many others, to believe that why not take your lumps with, guys like Jalen Hawkins and Richie Grant at that point, because it's not going to be worse than some of the weaker performances we've seen from guys like Harris and Harmon. But I think, Coach Pease makes a good point that I can respect, because essentially he was saying that if you throw some of these young guys out there and they struggle, not only could they lose confidence in themselves, but then their teammates could lose confidence in them. And then it essentially becomes a much harder job for you as a coach to try to then turn them into effective players down the road, when you are going to need those guys to really develop, in years 2, 3, and 4, than it would be just to bring them on at a more reasonable pace, at least in year 1. So, that's part of it, why I'm not necessarily chomping at the bit as hard as some other folks are when it comes to several young players, whether we're talking about the safeties, whether we're talking about the young corners, whether we're talking about some of the young guys in the front seven, like Michael Walker, as one I've seen a lot of people point out in recent weeks, is why aren't these guys getting more reps? And again, obviously, if you've listened to this podcast, you've heard me express that I do think certain guys should be getting more reps, or whatever the case may be, or at least I'd like to see several guys get more reps. But I won't necessarily go as far as to criticize the coaching staff for not giving those guys reps. I don't feel like they're doing a bad job. Probably the biggest question mark I would have is why Jacob Tuioti-Mariner is not getting as many reps as an edge rusher as, some alternative options that the Falcons are trotting out there. as far as the edge rush goes, but it's certainly not something that even if he is only going to get like 5 to 10 snaps a game, it's not going to cause me to pull my hair out. And while others may be more than welcome to pull their hair out, I don't have that much hair to pull out or anything like that. But I wouldn't necessarily criticize others if they were more critical of the coaching staff for not playing some of these young guys. But I think everybody's certainly entitled to their opinion. But I think this is one of the instances where I do try to see things from the coach's perspective, and if it makes sense to me from their perspective, I'm not going to necessarily kill them or overly criticize them for something that is a seemingly plausible perspective to have from their framework. So I think that's just something to keep in mind in the future when you're wondering, why aren't we playing this guy or that guy or whatever the case may be. I think there's still a lot of season left to be played. Who knows? Several of these guys could be getting significant reps in November and December. So I would stress a little patience in that regard with some of these young players moving forward. And I also stress patience with Caleb McGarry and his continued development. And we'll talk about one aspect of that going up against this Panthers pass rush, and it involves him and the pass protection. And the Falcons should be trying to do the exact same thing with Caleb McGarry this week as they did with Jason Spriggs last week in the Miami game. And we'll get into exactly what that is coming up on today's Locked On Falcons episode. But I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen of the day. And of course, that while we have all things covered on the Falcons, what's going on around the rest of the league, what's going on this weekend and next week in regards to the upcoming November 2nd trade deadline, as well as what's at stake for several teams in the second half of the season. And of course, the Locked On Podcast Network has you covered with the live trade deadline show for the NFL. We know that there aren't necessarily huge trades in the NFL at the trade deadline like there are in other sports, but that live show that will be coming at you from 3 to 5 p.m. on Tuesday, November 2nd at the trade deadline won't just be focusing on, trade season, but also be focusing on the second half of this 2021 season and giving you that NFL preview. So definitely go check out the live Locked On NFL trade deadline show on the Locked On NFL YouTube page. And of course, you can subscribe to that on the Locked On NFL YouTube page. So it's spooky season, and you guys want to make sure that you're in the mood for this weekend's festivities by ordering yourself a box of the latest flavor of Built Bar. Built Bars, of course, are the best tasting protein bar on the market, and their new flavor, Paranormal Pumpkin, is like all Built Bars, a great tasting protein bar. It's healthy. You only get 140 calories, just 7 grams of sugar, and 17 grams of protein. And I know this weekend, a lot of us, myself included, will be housing on, tons and tons of candy, whether you're, picking off the leftovers or you're just snatching some from your kids' goodie bags when they're not looking. But Built Bars are a better alternative because they're great. They taste just like a candy bar, but they're healthy too. They contain 100% real chocolate. They're soft and easy to chew. You get none of the guilt of, eating gobs and gobs of candy by eating a Built Bar or two, because they're healthy, they're low in sugar and calories, high in protein and fiber. So go order yourself some today at built.com and use the promo code LOCKED15, and you'll get 15% off your first order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So we'll wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, by doing some self-promotion. I don't spend too much time promoting the columns that I write over at the Falcoholic. They usually drop every Friday morning or Friday afternoon. And there's another one, of course, dropping this Friday afternoon. And it involves the discussion of the Falcons pass protection and how that's key to the Falcons offense continuing to maintain its high level of performance this weekend, as well as next weekend against the Saints. And a lot of that is due to the Panthers and Saints having better defenses and mainly having better pass rushes than the Falcons have experienced these last couple of weeks. That seems weird to say, given the expectations from what we had against this Washington front going into the season and how that we would struggle against that unit, and the Falcons held up very well. And part of that was due to, my boy Caleb McGarry shutting down my other boy, Chase Young. But this weekend is going to present some challenges because we know Brian Burns has had a lot of success against Caleb McGarry. He's tag teamed with Hassan Reddick. Both of those guys are off to pretty good starts. And, basically the column focuses on what the team can do to help Caleb McGarry against those guys, similar to what they did to help Jason Spriggs against Emmanuel Ogbah this past week. And as I note in a column, the Falcons' game plan from going back and watching the film was very clearly to help Spriggs as much as possible and to limit how many times he was left on an island in pass protection. And I don't necessarily have an exact number for it, but I would guess at least 80% of the snaps where the Falcons were in a drop back passing game. So basically, not screens, not play action passes, not sort of 3-step drops or anything like that. But anytime, Spriggs was going to be asked to pass protect for more than like a second, or wasn't necessarily blocking on the move like you would in a play action passing play, they over 80% of the time, it seemed like they were giving him some form of help. And whether that was lining up a tight end on his side, outside him, so that the edge rusher going up against him couldn't necessarily pin his ears back with speed, or that was getting a chip from that tight end, or a chip from a running back, or a chip from a wide receiver before those guys released into their routes. You saw that, seemingly on over 80% of those sort of drop back passing plays. And it was very effective in making, Spriggs very effective in that game and minimizing his impact. And when we talk about impact, we're talking about that negative impact, because that's generally when people are only noticing offensive linemen impacting games is when they're being bad. And so for most of you, outside of one or two plays, you probably didn't notice that Jason Spriggs was the starting right tackle. And that's a testament to the Falcons game plan going exactly how they plan to do it. And I think they should do the exact same thing with this Carolina team with Caleb McGarry this upcoming week, going up against guys like Brian Burns and Hassan Reddick, because if they don't, I think that's a failure on the coaching staff. And it just gets back to a narrative that you've heard me time and time again talk about. And it just, further implements this, where, over the last several months on this podcast, you've heard me talk about how, I don't think Caleb McGarry being underwhelming, let's say, is as big a problem for the offensive line as, other problem areas of the Falcons offensive line, like left guard and center would be, if those starters at those positions with Jalen Mayfield and Matt Hennessy were underwhelming. And, I certainly think Caleb McGarry needs to play better, but, I don't necessarily need him to play at a super high level, because I think the Falcons can mitigate some of his underwhelming performance by doing some of these things that we're talking about, whether it's chips, whether it's adjustments with the screen schemes and the protections and whatnot. And, one of the things I also break down in the article is sort of how Jake Matthews has been, outstanding in situations like this as a pass protector when he's been stuck on an island. When you look at the Pro Football Focus data so far this year, he's been, one of the best left tackles in the league when it has come to the Falcons putting him in a straight drop back passing game, or putting him on an island in pass protection. I break that down further in the article. But, one of the things I've mentioned several times on the podcast over the years of why Jake Matthews is so underrated is because the Falcons almost never give him help. And, when people criticize Jake, I don't think people appreciate the degree of difficulty that he is under, because he almost never gets help from any additional help. And the Falcons generally give all the help to other players on their offensive line. That's been the case going back to at least 2018, if not before. And so, that ability that Jake has on that left side does free them up to basically give as much help as they possibly can, like we saw in Miami with Jason Spriggs. But moving forward with Caleb McGarry, as we hope to see Caleb McGarry improve, but until he is comfortable being on an island against some of these premier pass rushers, the Falcons should do everything that they can to help him so it doesn't necessarily derail their offense. And this is part of the reason why I tend to have a little less patience for the Falcons left guard and center like Jalen Mayfield and Matt Hennessy when they struggle, then, and the opposite is seemingly true where other people, when it comes to Caleb McGarry, struggles. And I understand why that is, because, Mayfield and Hennessy are, I think they've started 7 games for Mayfield and 9 games for Hennessy so far this in their NFL careers. And so they're at the beginning of their careers, and people are going to be a little bit more patient to sort of see what they develop into. And, meanwhile, Caleb McGarry's, started 30 plus games, 35-ish games, or whatever the number is at this point in time in his career, 2.5 years. And so people have far less patience for his ongoing struggles, given the added experience that he has. And I certainly understand that. But from my perspective, and I'll keep stressing this, is that because of some of these factors that we're talking about, being able to chip at the right tackle position, basically if you're going to have a below average starter at any one of those three positions, at least the argument I'm making is that you can probably best afford to have a below average starter at the right tackle position, because you can give that guy more help than you can with these chips and whatnot than you can with the left guard and center. Now, typically you will slide your protections to the left, which means that the center will help the left guard out a lot more. But at some point, those guys are still going to be stuck on an island, just like the right tackle at some point is still going to be stuck on an island from time to time. You can't always give that guy help. So it's just one of those things, though. I just think, when you couple that with the other issue that, Matt Ryan's style of play is much more of having a clean interior pocket to step up into and be able to step into some of his throws. That's why I tend to not give as much leeway to the Jalen Mayfields and the Matt Hennessy's, despite their youth, as I do a Kaleb McGarry, because I feel like you can basically do more with less at that right tackle position than you can at the left guard and center position. Basically, the argument I've made in the past is that if you have poor interior line play, it's going to break this offense way more than it would be if you have, if Kaleb McGarry's continues to be up and down and inconsistent as he has been so far in his NFL career. So that's basically the case I've made in the past. And, hopefully we'll see that reflected. Hopefully, we'll get to a point, later in the season where, in week 17 or whatever, going up against the Saints or whatever, where we can feel confident with Kaleb McGarry based off of how he plays over the next 10 weeks, where we can, week 18, I'm sorry, my brain still can't wrap my head around the 17-game schedule. Week 18 against the Saints, where we can trust him to go one-on-one against Cameron Jordan with little to no help and feel comfortable about that. That would be ideal, but in the meantime, play to win the game, right? Scheme to win the game. That was another thing that Dean Pease talked about in his press conference. His goal is to win games, not necessarily, take lumps with some of the young players. So that's where we're at right now. And hopefully, Kaleb McGarry will show improvement and growth as he has done at times this year. But in the meantime, the Falcons should certainly do their best to help him as much as they possibly can, particularly over these next couple of weeks against pass rushers that he historically, like Brian Burns and Cameron Jordan, has struggled against. He's had some good games against Cameron Jordan, but, there's usually one good game and one bad game against Cameron Jordan. And, you're playing with fire where you just, this next game is going to definitely be the good one. Like, maybe we'll see. So that's where we'll leave it at that, guys. And again, go check out that article for more insights into that subject, as well as, getting some of the exact details of why Jake Matthews is so underrated as he continues to be one of the more underrated players on the Falcons team over these last couple of years, given, the pressure of his position, being, when he does get beat, people tend to make a bigger deal out of it than they should. But again, as I said, they don't necessarily appreciate the degree of difficulty. And that article does at least somewhat explain that a little bit better. So that's where we'll leave it here today, guys, on today's Locked On Falcons episode. Of course, make sure you go check out any of the other shows here on the Locked On Podcast Network, including the Peacock and Williamson podcast, where you want to get insight into all 32 NFL teams beyond the Atlanta Falcons from NFL analyst Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson. Of course, Peacock and Williamson is free and available, like all Locked On Podcast Network shows, on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And of course, in addition to making Peacock and Williamson one of your potential second listens, of course, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves is another great second listen for you guys. Brian and Matt on Peacock and Williamson should be picking their games on Friday's episode. I believe that's the usual schedule that they have. So if you want to get some insights into, who you should be picking in these upcoming games, by all means, check out Peacock and Williamson, as well as the whole host of other Locked On network shows. So there you guys have it. If you want to send in your questions for future Q&As, of course, we do a Q&A every Wednesday. Of course, you can hit me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons, on Facebook, Locked On Falcons on Twitter, or you can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or, hey, you can leave a comment here on YouTube and Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Let me know if you have any questions there. So, guys, appreciate you for checking us out for another day here on Locked On Falcons. I hope you have a great weekend. Of course, we'll be back Sunday evening-ish with our rapid reaction to whatever happens in Sunday's matchup between the Falcons and Panthers. Hopefully, they can keep this winning streak going and give us some real momentum so that we can get into Hate Week, to kick off November with Hate Week going up against the state team. Like, no one cares about the Panthers, right? Much to the chagrin of Panther fans everywhere. They really want the Falcons. You ask most most Panther fans, the Falcons are going to be their biggest rival, and then meanwhile we're just like, yeah, no one cares. Like it's you're the other little brother that no one cares about in this NFC South streets. So go pick a fight with the Bucs or something like that. I don't know. Do you? But hate week's coming up for the Falcons. No, doesn't mean we're overlooking this game, but obviously we're going to get up for that week, regardless of what happens on Sunday. So we'll be back on Sunday for more insight into this Falcons Panthers game. I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Have a great weekend. Happy Halloween.